For a while they sat in a strange, gentle silence, the hum of the diner and the clatter of dishes filling the spaces between them. Outside, the storm continued to hammer the streets, but the thick glass muffled it into something distant and almost unreal, as though they had stepped into a separate world where time could breathe again. Marcus sipped his coffee, the heat soothing his throat and loosening the ache that had clung to his body since the bridge. Across from him, Ava held her mug in both hands but still hadn't taken a sip, staring into the steam as if it might reveal some answer she hadn't found anywhere else. Eli, more awake now, was perched against his father's side with sticky whipped cream on his upper lip, humming to himself as though he had already forgotten the storm. Every so often he would giggle quietly, fascinated by the steam rising from his cup. And Marcus noticed how Ava's eyes kept darting toward the boy. Her expression softened in those moments, a flicker of something Marcus couldn't quite name. Nostalgia, maybe, or longing. It struck him that despite her earlier words about having no one, Ava did not seem hardened against connection. She looked at Eli the way someone starving might glance at bread, hesitant but aching for a taste of something they once knew. Marcus decided not to push yet. He had learned through fatherhood that forcing words from someone rarely brought the truth. Patience was what opened people. He leaned back against the booth, rubbing slow circles on Eli's back, and said casually, "When I was carrying you back from the railing, you said you lost everything. Do you want to tell me what that means?" His tone was not sharp, not demanding, but laced with the same kind of invitation he had given her on the bridge when he'd asked her to take his hand. Ava's fingers tightened around her mug, her knuckles pale against the ceramic. She swallowed hard and kept her gaze fixed on the steam. "It's not a simple story," she said, her voice low, nearly drowned out by the clinking dishes across the room. "And I'm not even sure where to start. Everything just fell apart all at once, one thing after another, until it felt like there was nothing left worth holding on to." She paused, her throat working as if the words themselves were heavy stones. "My mom got sick last year, cancer. It moved so fast none of us had time to adjust. She was gone before I could even believe it was real. And after she passed, my dad couldn't hold himself together. He started drinking, shutting me out, blaming me for things I couldn't control. Eventually, he just left. One day he was gone and the house felt emptier than I thought possible." Her voice cracked then and she turned her head slightly, as though ashamed to let Marcus see her tears. He didn't move, didn't interrupt, simply let her speak. Ava drew a shaky breath and continued. "I tried to keep going. Tried to focus on school, on friends, but they didn't understand. Everyone has their own lives, their own problems. I started slipping, failed a few classes, lost my job at the cafe because I couldn't stop crying during shifts. One by one, the people I thought would always be there drifted away. Some got tired of my sadness, some just didn't know what to say, and then I was alone, carrying this hole inside me that kept getting bigger." She finally looked up, her eyes rimmed red, her cheeks streaked with tears that blended with the dampness of her hair. "When I said I had no one, I wasn't exaggerating. There's literally nobody left." Marcus felt the weight of her words sink into his chest like an anchor. He had seen loss before, had lived it, but hearing her story reminded him that grief took different shapes in every life. For Ava, it had hollowed her out before she'd even had the chance to build her adult world. For him, it had come later, after he had known love, after he had held his son in the glow of family. But in the end, the emptiness was the same, a crushing silence where laughter used to be, an invisible absence that pressed on the lungs until breathing became an act of defiance. "I know that hole," Marcus said softly after a long silence. He glanced down at Eli, who was now dozing against him, the hot chocolate finished, his small chest rising and falling steadily. Marcus brushed a curl from the boy's forehead and looked back at Ava. "I lost my wife 2 years ago. Complications during childbirth. One moment we were planning a future together. The next she was gone, and I was standing in a hospital room with a newborn in my arms, wondering how in the world I was supposed to go on without her." His throat tightened, but he pressed through the ache. "There were nights I thought about giving up too. Nights when the weight felt too much, when I couldn't imagine raising a child alone. But every morning Eli's cry reminded me I had no choice. He became my reason. Not because I stopped hurting, but because love was louder than the grief if I let it be." Ava stared at him, her eyes widening slightly as his words settled between them. Her breath trembled, and for a moment she seemed to wrestle with something unspoken. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for that," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I don't have anyone left to hold on to." "I don't have a reason." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes steady on hers. "That's where you're wrong. You don't have to start with a reason. You just have to start with a choice, to live one more day, to take one more step. The reason will come, sometimes in ways you don't expect. You think I knew Eli would save me before I held him? No. I just kept moving because something inside me refused to quit. You've already proven you have that spark. You reached for my hand on the bridge. That was a choice, Ava. A small one maybe, but it was life choosing itself." Ava broke down then, her face buried in her hands as sobs tore through her. They weren't the desperate cries of the bridge, but something deeper, more releasing, as if the dam of silence she had carried for months had finally cracked. Marcus didn't reach across the table. He knew sometimes grief needed space to spill out, but he watched, steady and present, until the tremors in her shoulders began to subside. When she finally looked up, her eyes swollen and wet, there was a faint but undeniable shift in her expression. The hollow look was still there, but beneath it Marcus saw something else. Fragility, yes, but also the faintest flicker of trust. She whispered, almost inaudibly, "Thank you." Marcus nodded, his chest tightening, and for the first time since that night began, he felt something like hope flicker within him too. Not the kind that promised everything would be easy, but the kind that whispered they weren't walking alone anymore. The diner was a time capsule of warmth compared to the storm outside. Its big windows, fogged by condensation, glowed with golden light, and the smell of fried food and brewed coffee wrapped around Marcus the moment he stepped through the door. The bell above their heads jingled, though no one turned immediately to look. Most of the patrons were truck drivers, late-shift workers, or lonely night wanderers too preoccupied with their own exhaustion to notice the three drenched figures who had just stumbled in from the storm. Marcus didn't mind the anonymity. It gave him space to breathe, but he could feel the girl beside him hesitate, as though the simple act of crossing the threshold into warmth was too much to bear. Her bare feet left damp marks on the black and white tile floor, her thin dress clinging awkwardly to her frame. For a moment she lingered just inside the doorway, her eyes darting around the room like a cornered animal unsure if it was stepping into danger. Marcus tightened his grip on Eli and turned back toward her. "Come on," he said gently, motioning toward an empty booth tucked in the corner. His tone carried no urgency, only quiet assurance, and though she still looked wary, she followed him. They slid into the booth, the cracked red vinyl squeaking beneath them. Marcus lowered Eli carefully onto the seat beside him, peeling off the boy's wet jacket. Eli stirred, rubbing his eyes, then settled against his father's side with the heavy trust of a child who believed his dad could shield him from any storm. Marcus smoothed the boy's curls and looked across the table at the girl. She sat stiffly, arms wrapped around her body, eyes fixed on the laminated menu as though she had no idea what to do next. Her face was pale, lips still tinged with blue, and her fingers tapped nervously against the edge of the table. A waitress approached, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a kind smile. She glanced at their soaked clothes, at Eli's sleepy face, and seemed to understand without asking. "Long night?" she said softly, setting down 3 mugs of water. "I'll get you some coffee and hot chocolate. On the house." Marcus opened his mouth to protest, but she shook her head. "Don't worry about it. You 3 look like you need it more than I need the change." With that, she turned back toward the counter, leaving them in a bubble of quiet. The girl lifted the mug of water with trembling hands and took a small sip, her eyes darting to Marcus as though waiting for him to break the silence. He studied her carefully, trying to piece together what kind of life could drive someone so young to the edge of a bridge on a night like this. He knew better than to push too hard. Pain, spoken too soon, could become a fresh wound. But he also knew that silence could bury her again in the despair he had just dragged her out of. "My name's, Marcus," he said finally, his voice steady but low, mindful of Eli leaning half asleep against him. "And this little one is Eli. He's 2, and he's the reason I keep putting one foot in front of the other, even when I'm dead tired." He gave a small, weary smile and glanced down at his son, who was clutching his father's sleeve in his sleep. "What about you? What's your name?" The girl hesitated. For a long moment she simply stared into the water in her cup, as though the swirling reflections might reveal an answer she wasn't sure she wanted to give. At last she whispered, "Ava." Her voice was so faint Marcus almost missed it, but when he repeated it softly, "Ava," she nodded. It was the first piece of herself she had offered, fragile as a thread, but Marcus treated it with the weight of something sacred. The waitress returned with steaming mugs of coffee and a small cup of hot chocolate topped with whipped cream. Eli stirred at the sweet scent, sitting up enough for Marcus to guide the warm cup into his tiny hands. The boy sipped clumsily, leaving a white smear on his upper lip, and Marcus smiled faintly before turning back to Ava. She stared at her coffee, the steam curling into her face, but she made no move to drink. "Why were you out there, Ava?" Marcus asked gently, his tone carrying no accusation. "On the bridge, I mean." He leaned forward slightly, not demanding an answer but offering space for one. Ava's hands tightened around the mug, her knuckles whitening. She swallowed, eyes fixed on the swirling surface of her drink. "I didn't plan it," she said finally, her words halting, as though dragging them out of herself required force. "Not exactly. I was just walking, thinking. And then I realized I didn't have to keep thinking anymore. I could just step off, end it all before the emptiness swallowed me whole." Her shoulders shook, though whether from cold or emotion Marcus couldn't tell. "Nobody would have stopped me. Nobody would have even noticed." Marcus let her words hang in the air, heavy and raw. He didn't rush to fill the silence because he knew sometimes the act of speaking grief was as important as hearing an answer. After a long pause, he said quietly, "But somebody did notice I did. And I couldn't let you go, not just because you matter, but because Eli was watching too. He may not understand yet, but I want him to grow up knowing we don't turn our backs on people, even when the world feels too heavy for them." Ava's eyes flicked toward the boy, who was licking whipped cream from his lip and letting out a tiny giggle that seemed to slice through the heaviness. For the first time since they'd sat down, Marcus saw a faint crack in her expression. Not a smile, not yet, but a softening. She blinked quickly, and a single tear slid down her cheek before she brushed it away with the back of her hand. The moment lingered, fragile and significant. Marcus knew this was only the beginning of something neither of them could yet define. Ava had given him her name, shared a glimpse of her pain, and chosen to sit in the warmth of the diner instead of vanishing into the cold. Those were small victories, but in Marcus's world, small victories were the foundations of survival. He reached for his coffee, savoring the heat in his hands, and thought to himself that sometimes saving someone wasn't about grand gestures. Sometimes it was about staying long enough to prove they weren't invisible. And tonight at least Ava was seen. The rain was still merciless as they began the slow walk across the bridge, every gust of wind threatening to shove them off balance, every crack of thunder rattling through their bones. Marcus moved carefully, each step deliberate, keeping Eli tucked close under his arm while his other hand remained locked firmly around the girl's cold fingers. She did not pull away, though she trembled with each stride as though half expecting her legs to give out beneath her. Her breath came in shallow bursts, fogging faintly in the air before being torn away by the gale. Marcus kept his gaze forward, watching the slick wooden planks of the walkway. But every few moments he glanced sideways to ensure she was still with him. Each time she met his eyes with a flicker of hesitation, yet the fact that she kept moving beside him was its own kind of answer. They reached the midpoint of the bridge, where the towers rose like massive sentinels, their cables vanishing into the mist above. Here the wind howled more fiercely, whipping the rain into their faces. Marcus stopped briefly beneath the shelter of the arch, leaning against the cold stone to gather his breath. His knee was swelling, pain radiating in hot bursts with every step, but he ignored it, shifting his weight to keep from collapsing. Eli whimpered again, stirring from restless sleep, and Marcus pressed a kiss to his son's damp curls, whispering softly that everything would be all right. He had no certainty in those words, yet he knew the boy needed to hear them, and sometimes reassurance was not about truth but about hope. The girl sank down beside him, hugging her knees to her chest, her thin frame shaking violently. She looked so small beneath the looming tower, like a ghost caught in the storm's grip. For a moment, Marcus feared she might retreat into silence again, that the fragile thread binding her to life might snap. But then she spoke, her voice raw and barely audible over the wind. "I thought nobody would notice. I thought I could just disappear and the world would keep turning like nothing happened." She pressed her face into her knees, the words tumbling out like water from a cracked dam. "I've lost my family, my friends don't speak to me anymore, and every day I wake up wondering why I even bother. Tonight I couldn't carry it anymore. Marcus listened without interruption, his chest tightening with every word. He had heard confessions like this before, not from strangers but from his own soul in the darkest hours of the night. He knew too well the seductive whisper of despair, the way it convinced you that you were invisible, unworthy, disposable. Yet he also knew the lie hidden in that whisper, the cruel deception that pain tried to sell. He turned his head toward her, his expression steady despite the storm's fury. "You're wrong about one thing," he said softly but firmly. "The world would notice. Even if you think no one's looking, your absence would echo. Somebody would feel it, even if you never imagined they would. And tonight, if you'd gone through with it, I would have carried that weight for the rest of my life. My son would have carried it, even if he didn't understand why. You matter more than you think." Her shoulders trembled harder, and though she did not look up, Marcus saw tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. It was a soundless cry, the kind that came from the deepest hollow of grief. He placed his hand gently on her back, offering steady pressure, not to force her but to remind her she was still here, still tangible, still human. After a moment, she leaned slightly into his touch, just enough to signal that she was not rejecting his presence. It was a small gesture, but to Marcus it felt monumental, proof that she had not fully surrendered to the darkness. Minutes passed like that. The three of them huddled together under the stone arch while the storm raged above. Eventually, Marcus knew they had to keep moving. Staying here meant risking illness for Eli, whose body was too small to withstand this cold for long. He pushed himself upright with a grunt of pain, his knee nearly buckling, then offered his hand once more to the girl. "We're not far from the other side," he told her. "There's a diner a couple blocks down. Warm lights, hot coffee. Let's make it there. Just a little farther, all right?" She hesitated, glancing out at the remaining stretch of bridge where the wind tore across the walkway with unrelenting force. Fear flickered across her face, not of the storm but of herself, of the fragility of her own will. Yet slowly she reached out again and placed her hand in his, gripping tighter than before. Marcus gave her a small nod of encouragement and began walking, each step heavy but resolute. The last leg of the crossing felt endless. Yet with every stride, Marcus repeated silent prayers, not the formal kind he had learned in childhood, but desperate murmurs born of survival. He prayed for strength to keep his grip on her hand, for courage to fight his exhaustion, for enough time to reach shelter before Eli's small body gave out. Each prayer was woven with determination, because Marcus had long since learned that faith was not about waiting for miracles, but about moving forward in the storm until the dawn finally broke. At last, the bridge gave way to solid ground. The city stretched ahead, lights blurred by rain, streets glistening like rivers. The sight of the diner's neon sign flickering faintly in the distance filled Marcus with relief so sharp it almost made him dizzy. He turned briefly to the girl beside him and found her watching the same sign, her eyes reflecting a faint glimmer that had not been there before. It was not hope, not yet, but perhaps the first spark of curiosity, a question about whether life might still offer something beyond pain. They pushed onward, step by heavy step, until the warm glow of the diner's windows embraced them through the rain. Marcus pulled the door open, the bell chiming above their heads, and the sudden wash of heat and light nearly overwhelmed him. The girl froze in the doorway, blinking at the unexpected normalcy of clinking cups and murmured conversations inside. But Marcus squeezed her hand gently and guided her in. For the first time all night, he felt a fragile sense of victory. They had survived the storm, and though he knew this was only the beginning, that her battles would not end here, and his own struggles would continue, Marcus also knew that survival was not measured by the absence of pain, but by the refusal to give in to it. Tonight, on a bridge meant to carry people from one side to another, he had carried her from despair back to the thin but real possibility of tomorrow. That was enough for now. The storm did not relent. It hammered the city as if determined to strip away every ounce of pretense, leaving only the raw truth of human fragility behind. Marcus sat hunched against the railing with Eli pressed to his chest, the boy's small body gradually quieting into hiccup-laced whimpers. The stranger beside him, this young woman he had pulled back from the jaws of the East River, was still shaking, though whether from the cold or from the storm raging inside her heart, Marcus could not tell. He studied her profile through the sheets of rain, the way her jaw tightened with each sob she tried to suppress, the way her hands clutched at the fabric of her soaked dress as if holding herself together by force. He recognized that posture. It was the look of someone trying to convince herself she still had control even as everything was unraveling. Marcus's own exhaustion pressed down on him like an iron weight. His body wanted nothing more than to collapse, to close his eyes and drift into the numbness of sleep, but his mind refused him that escape. He knew the dangers of surrender too well. In the months after his wife's passing, when grief had clawed through him like fire, he had flirted with the edge of despair more times than he cared to admit. There had been nights when Eli's cries were the only sound preventing him from vanishing into silence. Nights when the thought of leaving had tempted him, not out of selfishness but out of the desperate illusion that his pain might end. He had learned then that survival was not a single decision made once and for all. It was a choice carved again and again each morning when the alarm rang, each night when the weight of emptiness settled. He looked at the girl beside him and knew she was still in the middle of that brutal battle. "I don't even know why you stopped," she said finally, her voice brittle and hoarse, almost lost to the storm. "You could have just walked by, pretended you didn't see me. That would have been easier." Her words carried no accusation, only weary disbelief, as though kindness itself had become so foreign to her that she could not comprehend its presence. Marcus tightened his arm around Eli, who stirred slightly in his sleep and let out a breath heavy with fatigue. "Easier doesn't always mean right," he replied, his voice low but firm. "And I couldn't just walk past. Not when someone's life was hanging there. Not when my boy was watching, even if he doesn't understand yet. Someday he will, and when that day comes I want him to know his father didn't turn his back when someone needed help." The girl turned her face toward him, her soaked hair clinging to her cheeks. Her eyes searched his in the dim light as if trying to measure the truth of his words. What she found seemed to stir something faint inside her, though the hollowness remained like a shadow she could not shake. "But what if saving me doesn't matter?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "What if I can't be fixed? What if all I do is end up disappointing everyone again?" Marcus felt a pang of recognition at her question, because he too had wrestled with the same fear. How many times had he asked himself whether he was failing Eli by being tired, by being stretched too thin, by not being able to give his son the life he deserved? He had lived under that shadow, but he had learned to answer it with quiet defiance. He leaned slightly closer, his tone steady. "You don't have to be fixed. You're not a broken machine. You're a person, and people aren't meant to be perfect. They're meant to keep going, one step at a time, even when they stumble. The fact that you're here, breathing through this storm, tells me you're stronger than you think." Her lips trembled, but she said nothing. Instead, she hugged her knees to her chest, her entire body curling in on itself as though she might shrink small enough to vanish. Yet Marcus noticed something subtle. She was no longer leaning toward the railing. She was turned inward toward life, even if just barely. That shift, fragile as it was, filled him with a cautious hope. Eli stirred again, letting out a soft cry that reminded Marcus of the urgency pressing on them. They couldn't stay here on the exposed bridge much longer. The cold would seep deeper, and his son's small body was already trembling. He had to move them to safety, yet he was reluctant to leave the girl behind. He couldn't risk turning his back only to find that she had slipped away in his absence. He needed her to choose, even a little, to fight with him against the storm. He straightened with effort, ignoring the burning in his knee, and extended his hand toward her. "Come with us," he said simply. His tone carried no demand, only invitation, though his gaze held firm resolve. "You don't have to tell me your story right now. You don't have to decide what tomorrow looks like. Just walk with me tonight. Get out of the cold. Let's get somewhere dry. One step, that's all I'm asking." She stared at his outstretched hand as though it were something foreign. The rain poured over them both, the bridge vibrating with the storm's relentless force, but in that moment, time seemed to narrow to the space between his palm and her trembling fingers. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out. Her hand, cold and fragile, slid into his, and Marcus wrapped his fingers around hers, steadying her as though she were made of glass. Together they rose, unsteady but upright, their bodies braced against the wind. Marcus tightened his hold on Eli, feeling the small boy nestle closer for warmth, and glanced at the girl. Her steps were weak at first, but she followed, her gaze locked not on the railing behind her but on the path ahead. For the first time since he had seen her silhouette teetering on the edge, Marcus felt the faint stirrings of belief that perhaps this night could end not in tragedy but in a fragile kind of victory. The three of them moved forward slowly, rain hammering down around them, The city stretched out like a dark ocean on either side. The storm had not broken, but Marcus knew storms never lasted forever. And as long as they kept walking step after step, they could endure until the dawn. For several long minutes after the desperate rescue, Marcus could do nothing but sit slumped against the bridge railing with Eli pressed close against his chest, and the girl collapsed beside him, both of them shivering violently in the punishing storm. The rain lashed down with a fury that seemed determined to wash them away, the droplets pelting their skin until every inch of them was soaked through, their breaths puffing out in ragged clouds of steam that were torn away by the relentless wind. Marcus's knee throbbed sharply where it had slammed into the metal beam, each pulse of pain radiating up his thigh and settling deep into his hip. But he clenched his jaw and forced the discomfort aside. He could not let weakness claim him, not now, not with Eli wailing and the girl trembling in the darkness. His responsibility to protect, to hold on, to endure, those duties had been written into his bones long before this night. He shifted his weight carefully, rocking Eli to soothe him, and turned his attention toward the stranger he had just pulled back from the brink. Her hair, once long and likely beautiful, now clung to her face in heavy ropes, plastered against pale skin that seemed nearly translucent under the sickly yellow glow of the bridge's lamps. Her lips were blue from the cold, and her arms were wrapped tightly around herself as though she might somehow squeeze the pain back into her chest where it had first been born. Marcus could see the tremors rolling through her body, but what struck him more was the hollow emptiness in her eyes. It was not the look of someone startled by a near accident, nor the shame of a person caught in a mistake. No, this was a vacancy carved deep by grief, the gaze of someone who had been staring into the abyss for far too long and had almost surrendered to it completely. Marcus swallowed hard, uncertain of what words could possibly bridge the gulf between them. He was just a man, weary and bone-tired, carrying the weight of too many lost hours and too little money. He was no preacher, no counselor, no saint who could pour wisdom into another's despair, yet he knew something of darkness. He had wrestled with it in the quiet hours after his wife's death, in the suffocating silence of nights when Eli cried and he had no strength left to answer, in the sharp pinch of bills he couldn't pay, and dreams he could no longer afford to dream. That knowledge, raw and imperfect, gave him one sliver of common ground with this broken stranger, and perhaps he thought that might be enough. He adjusted Eli, kissed the boy's damp curls, then spoke, his voice low and steady, despite the roar of wind around them. "You're safe now. You're not alone out here anymore." The girl gave no reply at first, only a sharp intake of breath that bordered on a sob, but her shoulders shuddered more violently at the sound of his words. Marcus pressed on, the pain in his knee intensifying but his resolve deepening alongside it. "I don't know your name. I don't know what's been chasing you, what's been tearing you apart. But I know this, if the river took you tonight, it wouldn't erase the pain. It would only spread it. Somebody somewhere would carry that wound, maybe the way I've been carrying mine, and I promise you the weight is too heavy to pass along to anyone else." At that, the girl finally stirred, her hands dropping from around her ribs as if the pressure she exerted on herself had given way to exhaustion. She turned her head slowly, her eyes catching his in the faint light. They were startlingly young eyes that should have been filled with curiosity and laughter, but instead were rimmed with red from hours of tears, and shadowed with the kind of despair that hollowed people out from the inside. Her lips trembled before sound slipped through. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice rasping from the cold. "I've lost everyone. I have no one waiting for me, no one who'd even notice if I was gone." Her gaze flicked briefly to Eli, whose cries had softened to hiccuping whimpers. "You have him. You still have something to live for." Marcus inhaled sharply, the girl's words cutting like a blade through the fragile balance of his spirit. She was right. He did have Eli, and it was true that this small child was the anchor that kept him tethered to life when grief threatened to drag him under. Yet her statement carried an assumption he could not allow to stand. That worth was measured only by who might weep at your absence. That value existed only when mirrored in someone else's eyes. He leaned forward, his expression tightening, and replied with a grit that surprised even himself. "You are wrong about that. You don't need someone waiting for you to prove you matter. You're breathing, aren't you? You're hurting, yes, but you're here. That alone makes your life worth holding on to. Don't ever convince yourself otherwise." For a moment they sat in silence, the storm pressing down on them with unrelenting force, the bridge beneath them trembling with every gust of wind. Marcus could sense the war playing out inside her, despair still pulling at her, hope whispering faintly from somewhere far off. He recognized that war because he fought it himself almost every day, and though he often felt he was losing, Eli's little hand clutching his shirt or the sound of his son's giggle always gave him enough strength to rise again. He wanted to hand that same strength to her now, even if he had only a fraction to spare. Finally, she broke down. Her hands covered her face, muffling the sobs that shook her thin body. The sound was raw, jagged, and soaked with sorrow. Yet Marcus felt something shift in the air as she cried. An opening, a release, a sliver of life forcing its way back into her chest. He placed a careful hand on her shoulder, not gripping, not restraining, just offering presence. She did not flinch away. Instead, she leaned ever so slightly into the touch, as though she had been starved of simple human contact for far too long. Marcus tilted his head back toward the rain-smeared sky and closed his eyes briefly, letting the cold water stream down his face. He knew this night had altered something permanent in both of their lives. He had not planned to be a savior. He had only wanted to get his son home safely. But fate had thrown him into this collision with another broken soul. And though his arms ached, his knee screamed, and his spirit felt battered, he understood now that this was no accident. Sometimes the most desperate storms carried people straight into the arms of those who needed them most. The city wore the storm like a punishment that night. Rain slashed sideways, driven by a howling wind that rattled loose signs and carried scraps of paper through the air like broken-winged birds. The Brooklyn Bridge stretched across the East River, its iron cables groaning, its walkway slick with water that reflected the dull glow of street lamps. Cars hissed along the lower deck, tires cutting through flooded lanes, horns swallowed by the storm. Marcus Carter adjusted the small body cradled against his chest. His son Eli, 2 years old and fragile, slept fitfully, whimpering now and then as thunder cracked above the skyline. The little boy's curls were damp, his tiny fist clutching the collar of his father's coat. Marcus held him close, shielding him from the icy needles of rain. The coat wasn't much of a shield anymore. It was old, patched in places with fabric that didn't match, and now it was heavy with water. His shirt beneath was plastered to his skin, and his shoulders screamed from fatigue. He'd worked a double shift again. Overtime meant a little more money, but even then rent and daycare always seemed to outpace his paycheck. Still, Marcus walked. He walked because buses were delayed, taxis were too expensive, and Eli's daycare pickup had been late. He walked because every step was cheaper than paying for what he didn't have. His boot slapped the slick planks of the bridge. He kept his eyes low, focused on not slipping. With each step he counted silently. Numbers were something he could control, unlike the bills on the kitchen counter or the eviction notice he feared would one day arrive. Numbers at least obeyed. Then, through the storm, he noticed it. A figure. At first it was only a shadow blurred by the rain, a faint shape standing unnaturally close to the railing. Marcus blinked the water from his eyes. As he drew closer, the outline sharpened, bare feet against the cold steel, a thin dress clinging to a trembling frame, hair plastered flat by rain. The figure leaned outward, toward the dark void where the East River boiled below. Marcus's heart stuttered. He froze, clutching Eli tighter. For a moment, fear rooted him. The bridge was slick, the wind vicious. If he shouted, would he startle her? If he stayed silent, would she slip anyway? His throat ached, torn between terror and urgency. Then Eli whimpered, a small sound against his chest. It jolted Marcus into motion. "Wait!" he shouted, his voice cracking against the gale. The figure flinched, head turning slightly. She was young, late teens or early 20s. Her eyes glimmered hollow and dark beneath the lamplight. In that instant, her foot shifted. The soul lost grip. Her body pitched forward. Marcus didn't think. His legs moved before his mind caught up. He lunged, knee slamming into steel with a crack that made him bite back a cry. He thrust out his free hand and caught her wrist, just as her weight tipped over the railing. The world shrank to the feel of her icy skin in his grip. His palm clamped around her wrist, fingers locking like steel hooks. His muscles screamed as her momentum pulled him toward the edge. Eli burst into tears, his small wail piercing through the storm. "Don't jump!" Marcus bellowed, voice raw. "I've got you!" The girl dangled, legs kicking in the void, her other hand scrabbling at the slick railing. Rain blurred her features, but Marcus saw her lips moving. "Let me go," she rasped, her voice thin, swallowed by the storm. Please, I can't take it anymore. Marcus's breath came ragged, pain throbbing from his knee. His arm felt like it was being pulled from its socket. Still, he clung harder, clutching Eli with his other arm. His back pressed against the steel beam of the bridge, the weight of 2 lives straining every tendon in his body. No, he gasped, shaking his head. Not tonight. Not like this? Her sobs mixed with the rain. I have no one. I lost everything. Marcus's jaw clenched, his teeth grinding together. I lost too, he said hoarsely. But I'm still here. My boy's still here. And so are you. Her eyes flickered at the mention of Eli, whose cries now rose in desperate wails. The sound cracked through the cold wall she'd built around herself. For the first time, her gaze wavered. Marcus pulled inch by inch, dragging her arm back toward safety. His finger slipped once, but he tightened again, the thought of losing her a weight heavier than his exhaustion. Don't move, he shouted over the wind. The rain's making it slick. I'll lose my grip if you fight me. I don't deserve to be saved, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Marcus gritted his teeth. You don't get to decide that in the middle of a storm. You're breathing. That's enough reason. He heaved, using his back against the railing as leverage, dragging her upward. Her knee hooked the beam. Her other hand latched onto the cold steel. With one final surge, Marcus hauled her over and collapsed onto the soaked planks. His chest heaving, Eli still crying against him. The girl lay beside him, shivering, her dress plastered, her breath ragged sobs. For a moment, all 3 of them simply lay there, drenched and trembling, the rain washing over them like judgment. Marcus closed his eyes, clutching Eli tighter. The storm outside was brutal, but inside his chest, a storm even fiercer raged. The weight of survival, the fear of failing, and the strange, undeniable spark of connection between 2 broken strangers who had collided on the edge of oblivion. The diner had begun to thin out as the hour grew later, the last of the truckers sliding bills under their mugs before heading back into the storm. A few tired faces lingered at the counter, their gazes fixed on the glowing neon outside. But for the most part, the place had quieted to the steady hum of the coffee machine and the occasional scrape of silverware against plates. In that quiet, the strange trio in the corner booth seemed less like intruders and more like part of the scenery, as if the storm had delivered them here on purpose. Eli shifted restlessly, waking fully now, and pressed his sticky hands against Marcus's chest. His big brown eyes blinked curiously at Ava, who was still curled over her coffee cup, her shoulders tense. Eli studied her the way children do when they sense something different, not with judgment but with unfiltered curiosity. Then, with the innocence that came so naturally to him, he reached out a small hand across the table and touched the sleeve of her damp dress. Ava startled at the contact, lifting her head sharply, but when she saw the child's tiny hand resting on her arm, she froze. Eli giggled softly, unconcerned, and leaned farther across the booth, babbling a string of words Marcus couldn't even decipher. He was at that age where speech was a jumble of half-formed sounds. Yet the intent was always clear. See me, notice me, share this moment with me. Something flickered in Ava's expression then, a mixture of surprise and vulnerability. She stared at the boy as though no one had willingly reached for her in months. Her lips parted, and after a hesitation that stretched painfully long, she managed the faintest trembling smile. It was small, so fragile Marcus wondered if it might vanish in the next breath, but it was real. Carefully, as though she feared she might break the moment, she lifted her hand and let Eli's tiny fingers wrap around hers. Marcus watched silently, his chest tightening with something he hadn't expected. It was one thing to pull Ava from the edge of the bridge, but it was another to see his son, in all his unknowing innocence, offer her a thread of connection. Eli didn't see grief or shame or failure in her. He saw a person, warm enough to touch, human enough to share laughter with, and in that simplicity, Marcus realized, lay the beginning of healing. Ava let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, her other hand covering her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks. He doesn't even know me, she whispered, shaking her head as though baffled by the child's instinctive acceptance. And yet he just reached for me like it doesn't matter who I am or what I've done. Marcus leaned forward, his gaze steady on her. That's the thing about kids, he said quietly. They don't care about your mistakes or your past. They don't carry the weight of judgment. They just feel whether you're safe, whether you're kind, whether you'll see them. Eli reached for you because he sensed something you've forgotten about yourself. that you still matter. Ava's eyes darted between Marcus and the boy, who now leaned happily against her arm, babbling nonsense while clutching her fingers like they were his favorite toy. She laughed again, a shaky sound that was nonetheless genuine. I can't remember the last time anyone made me feel like I mattered, she admitted, her voice breaking. I've been invisible for so long. Even before the bridge. I think I stopped believing I could ever be seen again. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding too well. I felt invisible after my wife died. People sent flowers at first, made casseroles, said all the right things. But weeks turned into months and suddenly everyone moved on. They had their lives, their families, their celebrations. And I was just the guy with the baby, trying to figure out how to keep the lights on. Nobody meant to make me invisible, but grief isolates you. It builds a wall around you. The hardest part is remembering that wall isn't permanent, unless you let it be. Ava's grip on Eli tightened, as though clinging to that small, tangible proof that the wall could be breached. She looked down at the boy who had begun to hum softly while tracing invisible shapes on her hand with his finger, and whispered, Maybe I don't want it to be permanent. Maybe I just don't know how to take it down. Marcus reached across the table, his large, calloused hand resting gently near hers, not overlapping but close enough to remind her she wasn't alone. You don't have to tear it down all at once. Brick by brick, that's enough. Tonight was the first one. You came inside. You spoke your truth. You let Eli hold your hand. That's 3 bricks already gone. His voice softened, carrying a quiet conviction. Tomorrow, maybe you let someone else see you. Maybe you take one more step. That's how you break walls, and not with a hammer, but with persistence. Ava sat back slowly, her expression unreadable for a long moment. Then she exhaled long and shaky and nodded. It wasn't agreement in full, but it was acknowledgement, and for Marcus that was more than enough. He knew healing was not a single leap, but a series of fragile steps. Ava had taken hers, and the fact that she was still sitting in front of him rather than drifting back into the storm was a victory worth holding on to. The waitress reappeared, setting down plates of pancakes and scrambled eggs that smelled like salvation. Eat, she said kindly, glancing between the 3 of them. Hot food helps more than you think. Marcus thanked her, and Ava murmured something soft in reply, her eyes lowering as though unused to kindness. Eli clapped his hands at the sight of pancakes, and Marcus cut them into small bites, sliding a piece across the plate toward Ava. She hesitated only briefly before picking it up, chewing slowly as though her body needed reminding of what warmth tasted like. They ate in silence for a while, the kind of silence that wasn't empty but simply full of exhaustion. Outside, the storm began to soften, its violent roar fading into a steady drizzle against the glass. When Ava finally spoke again, her voice was quieter, steadier. Thank you for not walking past me, she said, her eyes fixed on Marcus. If you had, I wouldn't be sitting here right now. Marcus held her gaze, his expression firm but gentle. I didn't just save you, Ava, you saved me too. Because tonight reminded me why I keep fighting. Why I keep showing Eli that even in the hardest storms, we don't give up on people. Her lips trembled, but this time when she smiled, it held, small, fragile, but real. For the first time since he had seen her silhouette on the bridge, Marcus believed that maybe, just maybe, Ava could begin again,